The Banished are beautiful. Seeing as Halo is a series that gets new installments every few years, it's wise to introduce new villains and conflicts for the heroes of the universe to fight. While Halo 3 had humanity allying itself with a heroic new Green Covenant led by the Arbiter, Halo 4 introduced the idea of evil Covenant remnant factions following the death of Truth, and it tried really hard to make them a worthy successor to the original Covenant, but I never really ended up liking them. They were great conceptually, but the execution I found to be sort of confusing and underwhelming. The Covenant of Halo 4 and 5 were led by a leader named Jul Mdama, who believed in the promise of Promethean technology. Jul Mdama would avoid large-scale invasions of UNSC space and instead seek out Forerunner technology, so he could suddenly unleash his new Covenant on humanity with the newfound power the Prometheans would grant him. In Spartan Ops, he carried himself with confidence, gave grand speeches about the power they'd inevitably find if they just kept searching. This new Covenant would awaken the secrets of the Forerunner Empire and rise to new heights never before seen. Jul Mdama was ultimately a chump, a dreamer who let his ambitions cloud reality. He may not like to admit it, but he was a very emotionally driven leader who would frequently get distracted by his own speeches, excitedly hyping up the potential his Covenant had. He'd chase whispers of treasure across the stars, and thanks to Halsey, he got sidetracked and eventually manipulated into the right place for a Spartan fire team to successfully assassinate him. In 2015, Jul Mdama was a character I thought was going places in the Halo universe, and his death really angered me as a Halo fan. In hindsight, this was silly of me to think that this guy was heading anywhere but his own grave. He let his hatred of humanity and dreams of hidden treasures and magical superweapons override logic. He led his Covenant without a vision, and just a hope that any minute now a secret Forerunner artifact or ancient god would reveal itself, and then he'd be king of the galaxy. This doesn't make him a bad character, by the way. It's actually really interesting to have such a seriously flawed and egotistical villain. But I did say I didn't like his Covenant too much, didn't I? And I did say that. The reason I didn't like Jul's Covenant is because I feel they weren't written to this inherent strength. Instead of pursuing the concept of this underpowered, poorly led Covenant remnant that were dangerous because they were so desperate, the games instead tried their hardest to write them as if they should be held in the same high regard as the real Covenant. When you get to the mission Sunayon in Halo 5, the chapter card at the start says, "The Fall of the Covenant," as if this was supposed to hold the same gravity and weight as the death of Truth in Halo 3, and it didn't. That chapter title still bugs me to this day because it's unearned and kind of inappropriate. Halo 3 was the fall of the capital C Covenant. Sunayon was a cleaning up of the leftovers, and the game tried really hard to pretend it wasn't. Jul's Covenant were not worthy successors to the Covenant, in my opinion. They were cool as a galactic Cold War villain, but they weren't successors, no matter how hard the Reclaimer saga tried to make them. So who were the worthy successors? Well, the Banished, and honestly, I don't just mean because they look cool. The Banished origins date back all the way to something that always lingered in the real Covenant: an unspoken but understood contempt for one another. Like most fascist forms of rule, a society like this thrives on having layers upon layers of oppression. The Grunts and Jackals may hate humanity with the same religious fanaticism as the Brutes, Elites, and Holy Prophets, but they'll never be equal to them. Same goes for the Elites and Brutes. Societies like these survive as long as they do by giving you someone to oppress and hate so that you don't notice you're being oppressed yourself. The Covenant was a religious empire that was a breeding ground for revolutionary thinking, and the most successful of those who rose up was the brute, Atriox. The Covenant called the act of executing a heretic banishing. They're cut down with a ceremonial red energy sword by an elite in priest-like armor. They're banished from the Covenant and the universe itself. Atriox was sentenced to a banishing for his open hatred of the Covenant. If it weren't for his actions during the ceremony, he'd probably just be another name in their holy scriptures about the unfaithful. He defied the Covenant, slew the banishing priest, and became the start of a new great journey, one without lies. The name Banished was worn with pride. The ceremonial banishing blade was forged into his very gravity hammer, and the red glow became the accents and color scheme of his new Banished faction. It's almost poetic that the Banished leader, Atriox, wears ghastly white face paint and sports scars that make him resemble a skull more than anything. He's a vengeful spirit, the embodiment of those that the prophets silenced throughout the years, back from the grave, glowing red with anger. He took those faithful to him and retreated into the stars, raiding Covenant stockpiles here and there, capturing a ship or two, growing and waiting. As humanity and the Covenant went to war with each other, Atriox just waited in the shadows and watched the Covenant Empire crumble, staying quiet and growing ever larger until his forces became large enough to become a serious military threat. Red flags were ignored by the UNSC as they grew. It's fine. They're just another splinter faction like Dama. Well, in Halo Infinite, it seems the Banished grew too large for the UNSC to control. Back in 2015, Halo 5's story and direction were so alienating to me that it honestly disconnected me from the series' narrative. I had no interest anymore in pursuing the conflict. I had no interest in these characters, the music, the look, and the world of this new sci-fi universe that used the Halo name. It didn't feel like Halo anymore, and I just wanted to leave. I found solace in universes like Destiny, and made my art style videos and other such videos voicing my issues with the direction the Halo series was going in, coming to peace with the fact that Halo 6 was going to be a game I had no interest in, narratively. That was until Halo Wars 2. You know how sometimes you can get deja vu at random moments about things from your childhood? It can be a red swing that suddenly brings back nostalgic memories of playing as a kid, or a jingle on TV that reminds you of your love for fictional worlds. Halo Wars 2 was a shock to my Halo heart, and a shock that it needed. The cutscene of Atriox crushing the Spartan helmet, I remember affecting me emotionally in a way I didn't expect. It re-energized me, reminded me of the Halo universe I fell in love with. In a corner of the Milky Way, far away from the nonsense of Halo 5, the Banished were finally flexing their muscles. They took advantage of the UNSC's civil war with their AI to capture the Ark for themselves. We got to explore their mannerisms and quirks through the ridiculously fun story DLCs and the Phoenix logs. Atriox was very angry and passionate as an individual, and our understanding of him through the game gives me the vibe of someone who is very focused and organized, the opposite of Dama. But he is also in danger of falling victim to the very anger that drives him. He seems to conveniently ignore systemic issues with his Banished, and makes use of slave labor via the engineers. Atriox has the shadows of the prophets on his shoulders. He's in danger of unintentionally becoming the very thing he tried to break away from. There's a lot to explore with the Banished, and Halo Wars 2's rather brief narrative left me hanging. The downside of Halo Wars 2 was that there was still bleed over from Halo 5, such as the weird Promethean-y Forerunner designs, as well as the understanding that once this really fun side story was over, I'd unfortunately have to return to the much less interesting universe. And then, Halo Infinite was revealed to be the next Halo game, a spiritual reboot for the series, sporting the Banished in a seemingly high position of power, a fractured and ruined UNSC as a result of their civil war against their own AI from Halo 5, and I love it! The Banished have retroactively made Halo 5's story more interesting. A tale of a galactic cold war against shallow pretenders and a UNSC that was growing way too big for its own britches. discontent from outer colonies, and this uneasy feeling that it was all gonna blow up at any minute, until it did. What the Banished do that's so clever is they reinvent the stupid AI takeover not as the next big bad, but as the natural endpoint of a post-Halo 3 galactic Cold War, a sudden and violent uprising within the UNSC. Atriox was smart and allowed this to eventually happen. He saw it happen to his own Covenant. He happily stayed in the shadows and just kept growing until his forces were large enough that they couldn't be ignored. The Banished are Halo's best successor to the Covenant, not because they're trying to mimic the Covenant, but because they were birthed from the very mistakes of the Prophets. They are a direct consequence of how the Prophets conducted themselves, and this is what makes me excited to take them on. We have no idea what the context of Halo Infinite's conflict will be. Is the UNSC still dealing with their internal AI civil war? Are the Banished collaborating with these AI systems? Are the Banished large enough to have surprised all parties and, like a monkey wrench or something, just completely disrupted it all? Halo Infinite's inclusion of the Banished is the most refreshing and energizing direction the series could have taken. I had no interest in fighting the Created, and Halo Infinite's narrative is making smart choices that reach into the past and recontextualize them to enhance the story it's now going to tell. Halo Infinite itself was rather rough looking, from the stiff and sometimes glitchy animations to the unconvincing lighting and inability to make distant scenery look convincing. So the delay that it's going through is actually incredibly appreciated. I'd prefer a better game. People have seemingly moved on from the initial shock of how just rough the presentation was, and now people are discussing and analyzing the substance of what the Banished are and what Halo Infinite means for the future of Halo's story. Genuine positivity is starting to happen, and it's a positivity I haven't seen from the Halo community in a while. It's energizing. This is where I'm going to end it so that I don't go on for too long and lose track of the point I'm trying to make, but this is why I love the Banished, and why they get me excited for the story of Halo Infinite. How do you feel about the Banished, and how do you feel they're going to impact the future of the series? Do you agree with my views on them? Discussions down below are appreciated, seeing as I do actually read my comments. You can also check out my subreddit to continue the discussion further, and with all that being said, guys, leave a like, share, and I'll see you on the next video.